stream it over YouTube, but
I know, but you're shrink. Just imagine they're
but
on
it
your
won't
hands.
actually amplify your talk.
Okay.
It's just going into streaming. Brilliant.
All set?
Yep, it's going.
Great. Okay. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to welcome Marie, who's comes to talk to us today about her really fascinating work in data visualization. So you probably read her bio. She currently works at The Guardian, and she did a residency at Deacon's Motion Lab too.
It was just a brief lab. Wasn't
thing.
residency, but
Yeah, and she worked overseas quite a bit as well, and so she's had a fascinating career so far, and does really exciting work, so we're really happy to have her here. Thank you, Ree. We're looking forward to hearing what you've got to say about data visualization and making it beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'm Ree. I specialize in data visualization. I originally kind of came into that world through design. I studied IT and communication design at uni, and then worked for a few years in web design, web development before moving into data visualization specifically. And what really appealed to me was the way you can use sort of design skills to get people to connect with really complex data. So that was the thing that really appealed to me with data visualization. So currently I work at The Guardian, where I create interactive content and data journalism type stories. And I'll go through a little bit about that work. I haven't actually been there that long, so I don't have a lot to show you. And then also some of my personal pieces that I've done kind of on my own, different data sets that I've explored, and with the Deakin choreographic coding lab that I participated in, looking at 3D motion track dance data. And so just to kind of go a little bit high level, so data visualization sits kind of between these two disciplines of science and art, and we've got these the specific industries: data science, statistics, computer science, and on the other end you've got more graphic design, journalism, information design. So one end is very concerned with the stats, the data, the numbers, and the math side of things, while the other is more about the communication, the actual visualization aspect. How do you express the data and find novel ways of showing it? And one thing I found kind of working in the field and following a lot of people, that these two halves are often at odds, which is a little bit unfortunate, because I think the best work usually happens when they're working together. So I sit a little bit more on the creative end, given my design skills. And so in my work, I try to think of interesting graphical representations and interesting things to do to visualize, interesting ways to visualize the data. And so the critique that comes from the more science statistics side is that there's, when you kind of play with data, there's this danger of manipulating or misleading people if you kind of are misrepresenting the numbers in a certain way. And on the other end, there's kind of the critique is if you reuse the same type of graphical representations, if you reuse bar graphs, pie charts, people kind of tend to get a little bit tired. They want to see something different. And so the best results, best work usually comes when the two sides come together and create data visualizations that are truthful but also engaging and beautiful. So some of the type of work that I do at The Guardian includes stuff like this. So currently we're in an election campaign cycle, so that's kind of dominated a lot of my work at the moment. And so a lot of these types of pieces use data as a way to inform and engage the public about current events. And so we released this campaign tracker to essentially answer questions about what are the themes of the two major party leaders of their campaign, and where they've been, what electorates they visited. Are they focusing particularly on marginal electorates in particular? And to kind of collect this data and visualize it, so you kind of have a different side of things and see, you know, for example, Bill Shorten, you know, is obviously basing his platform very heavily on education, whereas Malcolm Turnbull is focused on economy. So you kind of get those types of insights through this visualization. Some of the interesting challenges with working on this particular project was the geographic challenge, the cartographic challenge of the map of Australia, which unfortunately, I don't know if anyone's worked in geography. Sarah, I know you might be familiar with this problem, that Australia has high population density in certain areas and then large land mass with very few people, and so it's a big challenge to actually be able to see the individual electorates because they're based, they're drawn around population density. And so I opted for more of an abstract representation rather than an accurate geographic one. So I created this map using hex grids and plotted out drew out the electorates by hexagons to kind of so you can kind of identify each individual electorate more accurately. And so that was one of the interesting things I worked on and have been working on the last few months. It's been very election focused. Some of the other stuff that I've done includes kind of this type of project, which is based on more of a topical news kind of story as a complement to that. So I'm not sure if you remember this, but UQ put on a feminist bake sale where they were selling cupcakes, and they would sell them at a higher or lower price depending on whether you were male or female and which industry you worked on, according to the relevant gender pay gap. And so there was a bit of confusion around how this bake sale would work, and so I created this really quickly, this little calculator that would show you enter in your gender, you put in your which industry you worked in, and it would show you how much it would cost for you to get a cupcake. And this was to kind of experience more tangibly what it would be like to be at the bake sale, because a lot of people didn't understand how it worked. And so this is a more of a quick turnaround project that I've done. So some of my personal projects include this particular one I did looking at gender engineering numbers in sort of by gender in the tech industry. So having worked in technology and kind of feeling some of the events around gender discrimination myself, I kind of was inspired to create something with data that would get people's attention about this issue. And that is one of those things that is quite important in Silicon Valley. So I decided that hopefully, you know, just displaying this data would make people pay attention. So essentially I got a data set that had all these different companies and the number of men and women that worked in the engineering teams of these companies, and displayed them and shifted it kind of to the left or to the right depending on whether they were male dominated or female dominated. And you can see there's definitely a trend there. And so my goal in doing this was to kind of have something that people could kind of link to and reference and be like, you know, when people ask the question, is this really a problem? How, you know, maybe one particular company isn't doing so great. Well, no, it's actually all of them. And to have this proof that there is a wider problem in the industry. And so this is an interactive that you can jump online and play with, and you can sort by kind of different factors to see how the numbers vary as well. Another project I did more on a global scale was looking at this UN Human Development Report, and I pulled out the gender-related figures on that, and I explored a few facets. And the UN Human Development Agency put out like a call to get people to kind of submit their own data visualizations, and this ended up being a finalist for that. So I got luckily got flown out to Colombia to attend a UN data conference, which was quite interesting. But essentially, again, this is an interactive data visualization where you've got each country ranked by the gap between men and women in a particular facet. So I'll kind of get you a bigger close-up one so you can see what's happening here. So you've got the ranking for countries with the largest gap between men and women in the labour force in 2013, and then at the bottom ranked by the smallest gap. And so the blue dots show the male figures and the green dots show the female figures. And so the countries with the largest gaps, they're not really surprising. Afghanistan, Syria, they're not known for their gender equality. So in those countries, it's kind of expected that a lot of women would stay at home and the men would be active in the workforce. What's interesting is countries, when you sort it by the smallest gap between men and women, you see a lot of countries on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. And it's interesting kind of mapping out this data because a lot of the time, I'm not a historian or a sociologist, so I don't have the background context of what's happening in each of these in each of these countries, but there is a unique story that's taking place. And so just some quick Googling, you can see that Togo, Rwanda, a place like that, there's a heavy female workforce in agriculture. So it's not just the number of women, but it's also the type of work when we talk about issues like labour force. And so this is the kind of stuff that I tried to bring up with these types of pieces. Another facet I looked at was female participation in parliament, and these are the figures for 2015. And so these are the countries with the highest female participation in parliament. And if you kind of scan the countries, there's some predictable players. You've got Sweden, you've got Finland, Iceland. So Scandinavia, they're known for their wealth and gender equality. But then at number 1 and number 2, you've got Rwanda and Bolivia that aren't, they've been war torn, they aren't don't have a great history for women and human rights and all those types of issues. And so again, it brings up a lot of questions of why is that? It's a very interesting mix of countries that you see in the top 20. And so doing a little bit more digging, Rwanda has a history of genocide, which left the country with a much higher proportion of women compared to men. And the response of the government was to try and make their parliament more reflective of their population. So they put in place quotas of minimum number of women that had to campaign for or be considered for government positions. Bolivia actually did something similar, so you can kind of see for Rwanda it's an exact mirroring over the few years in which they put those quotas in place, that how much of an impact it is just by looking at the data. I can't really speak much for what's happened in the rest of the country since then and in society, but I mean it's definitely a positive step if the female parliament numbers have improved so much. And through this project it was very interesting kind of having my own expectations be crushed essentially. So if we look at where Australia sits, so in this it kind of lists all the countries and you have to scroll quite a lot to get to Australia. In case you haven't spotted it by now, we're here, 52. Next to Iraq, and with Afghanistan doing slightly better. So we're not doing great on the global scale in terms of female participation in government. And so it's one of those things, I mean, we here in Australia we do so well in a bunch of other ways. Our living standards are fantastic, but if you look at the data, there are a lot of things that we should be improving on. But if we kind of look on the bottom end of the scale, these are all the countries with the biggest gaps. So you can see all the countries there that still have all men, not to mention just majority male parliaments. And so there's a lot of work to do before we have kind of governments around the world reflecting their people a lot better. And so what's interesting about doing a project like this and publishing it is getting some of the interpretations of people and see how they respond to the visualization. And so people responded really well in unexpected ways, but what was striking to me was that a lot of people personalize and localize this data and kind of said, hey, Rwanda's doing better than New Zealand at female representation in parliament, and they drew their own stories. And the finding that I had was that you don't really need to explicitly tell people these stories. When you give them the data, when you present it in an interesting, engaging way, they'll automatically form their own opinions and answers from it, because people they tend to be curious about these things. I'd like to move on to another project, which is a little bit more open-ended and explorative. So this is kind of more data visualization through the lens of art. Last year I participated in a choreographic coding lab at Deakin. It was a kind of a 4-day intensive with a lot of 3D motion graphics type people. And this is the space at Deakin where they sequenced a bunch of dance movement data. And it's a little bit dark, but there's someone in the corner with a mocap suit. So it's essentially the suit, the black suit with the green balls on them. So it tracks each individual limb and body part in space and time and records that data. So that essentially is the end data I ended up using with. And this was an interesting exercise because I was kind of the only data visualization person in the room. I wasn't quite sure what I would make of this. And I wasn't quite sure of the end result. With some of my other projects, they've been very design driven, so there's kind of a goal and endpoint, but with creating more art type pieces, that there isn't that certainty. And so I kind of just trusted in my process and decided just to play with the data and see what I could come up with. And so as a first pass, I kind of just drew out a few isolated body parts. And so you can kind of see the figure move in time. So I isolated the head and the 2 hands and just drew little circles for each frame. So that's essentially like the bird's eye view of the dancer's movements, and I was quite pleasantly surprised with the end result. It was already its own kind of art form, derived from dance is already an art form, so it was kind of creating a new art piece from that. I decided to explore next a different dimension, so I wanted to look at speed, if I could kind of get something about the speed. But before that, this was kind of the tool I made, which loaded in all the different dance data sets, and then I kind of play with different representations and playbacks. And so this is the one looking at speed. So in this one, I increased the circle size if there was faster movement, and I was really shocked to see that how smooth. I mean, it makes sense when you think about the movement. You don't suddenly be fast and then slow, but it was definitely cool to visualize that transition. And they come out like brush strokes, which was quite nice as well. And for the next sketch, I decided to explore if there were any relationships between body parts. So I connected lines between different limbs, so the left hand and the right ankle, and the right hand and the left ankle, just to see if you can kind of see mirroring or symmetry happening with the movement. And I quite like this one because it's very abstract. And so this particular dance technique is called counter technique, and it's very based on like momentum of the body, and it's very flowy, so you can get a little bit of that. And then I played around a little bit with just fading out the lines, and then they kind of really don't really look like body movements anymore, and kind of look like birds or something very abstract. And so the main kind of focus around some of my work as someone with a design background is thinking about metaphors in data visualization. So traditionally, data graphics thought as more pre-packaged concepts. So you've got bar graphs, you've got pie charts, line graphs, and they're heavily utilized in the business world, and people are very familiar with them. So I like to think about outside of that a little bit. And so thinking about metaphors are very strong devices that we kind of navigate the world with, and we feel quite intuitively. So it's something I try to incorporate into my work. So for example, with the gender in tech one, I use that skew, that sense of balance, that metaphor to kind of give you that sense that something's not quite right. And again, in the Close the Gap project, the closing the gap is its own metaphor in kind of resolving that and finding closure. And kind of one way I'd like to illustrate that type of thinking is, instead of thinking about data as spreadsheets and cells and this vast quantity of information, is just to think about how a single number can be represented. So if we think about, say, one number, just 5, how can we represent this number? So this number could be a point in space, so XY coordinate. It could be size, comparative size, scaling of two things. It could be a multiplier, number of sides on a shape, point on a color scale, maybe an opacity. And so I kind of encourage people to think about numbers more in that way than think about the pre-packaged types of visual representation when it comes to data. And so I think that frees up the thinking a little bit. And obviously, in data visualization, there is a sense of responsibility, because these numbers are often connected to real world people and events. And so it's not just kind of playing around or free experimenting. You do have to think about the context. But at the same time, it's good to free that up a bit and open it up. And so I do use code to create my data visualizations. The tool I mostly use is D3 in JavaScript. And one thing I really love about D3 is it does force you to think this way, to kind of go into one number and think about how to represent this number, instead of just thinking about the whole data set and I want to cram this into one type of visual representation. And so I ran a workshop that doesn't use code. So I think that this type of thinking doesn't just apply to using something like D3. So I ran this workshop at a conference that was held at Uni of Melbourne called ResVaz, and I got all these data sets and I gave them to all these PhDs and academics and got them to get their hands dirty and create some drawings and use craft to play around with data and more tangibly create something with data. And so just the general idea that I think anyone can visually express themselves with data. It's not just constrained to statisticians and coders. That I think data is becoming more and more relevant in everyone's lives, that it should be opened up and not be this disconnected concept that people don't engage directly with. And that's it.
Thanks, Ree. We've got time for questions. Anyone have any questions they'd like to ask?
got a question.
Maybe we could turn down
Hi.
turn up the lights so I can't see your faces.
Elliot will adjust.
I've crashed this lecture from communication design.
That's all
Oh,
right.
great.
I'm really interested in the work you're doing. You got immediate responses from one of your projects on Twitter, that
Mhm.
dance project, the beautiful generative art. Did you sort of collect any feedback or response from people from that?
I think that was more of a expressive piece, so people kind of like more like, oh, that's quite interesting, that's quite cool, but there wasn't that immediate insight from it that you got with the other piece because it was so kind of relevant to global issues and all that. So I think it was more a lot of people just aesthetically admiring it rather than from like the content. But I think a lot of people, I got some, trying to think back now, but people that were in dance found it interesting, and I did play it back to the dancer that you
Yeah.
saw in the video, and she could kind of see things about her movement that other people couldn't, so that was quite interesting as well.
Because I'm interested in kind of the next loop, so data visualization to generative art. Data visualization, you were sort of saying you can draw your own stories from that. That generative art, can you draw empathy or emotion out of that in an audience? Like, what sort of purposes a tool does it have beyond being beautiful?
Yeah, I kind of really wanted that to be a complement to the dance. So if you could kind of have this other layer, if you could have a dancer dance to a generated art form of someone else's dance, like that could be interesting when you bring in those things. I think when you kind of bring in a bunch of different elements, because there is this kind of connectivity with when you create generative art from a real source. There's like a connection there that you can use in that way.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I've got a question.
Hello.
I'm another communication designer. I think we've taken over. I was curious how you sort of brought up this duality between prepackaged responses and more sort of metaphorical sort of responses to displaying data. What I found was interesting that with the examples that you showed, that while they're quite interesting visually, they lacked in exactness. So, like in terms of actually showing a specific number. So I wonder why, given that's the case, why do you favour the more metaphorical? Like I could guess maybe it's just more about a sense rather than a. So I'm curious, why do you go more towards that?
Are you saying kind of the examples I showed weren't really
yeah, like
highlighting
especially
the
that
exact
slide
numbers?
where you had the dots and your opacities and the stars.
Yeah.
Like I'm curious what the rationale for going more towards that sort of end of the spectrum rather than sort of being very blunt about, you know, it's 67% versus, you know.
Yeah. I feel like that comes down to like a very core design principle of the whole relationships thing. So like a number that's contextless isn't very useful. So if you give someone like 72%, what are they going to do with that? You kind of have to add those relationships there. And so I think for for example, the gender in Tech 1, it's kind of like it doesn't really matter what the numbers are. You can kind of see that they're all shifted one way. So it doesn't matter if it's 80% to 20%. It's definitely you can get that context from that. So yeah, I hope that answers that question. Yeah.
I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about data visualizers that you know and you've met. I mean, a lot of them coming from a similar background to yourself. They're coming maybe from design and graphic design and then moving maybe into JavaScript, or have you met a lot that come from coding and then take up design? And could you elaborate a little bit on the broad community that data visualizers are that you know?
Yeah, that's interesting. So that diagram I showed you from Science to Art, of in my travels who I follow on Twitter and met at conferences, they fall on every, like if you were to plot it out in a data viz, they would fall on all the different ends. And so you've got some kind of more academic types that are, you know, you've got kind of the Edward Tufte camp. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of him, but he's got a very specific philosophy that you can't really add too much flair, and there's a bunch of rules that people have taken to gospel, and I do really like a lot of his work, and it's very important for the field. But at the same time, having all these hard and fast rules about what you can and can't do, I don't think is necessarily helpful. So I think on the other end of the spectrum, you've got people like Georgia Lupi and Stephanie Pozovic, who are more graphic design based, and so they do a lot more. So for example, that workshop I ran at ResBaz was directly inspired by their project Dear Data, where they have a correspondence back and forth, and they do like these little data graphics by hand about their day, and so they collect all these numbers about their lives and then send them to each other. And so, yeah, that has no preciseness. You can't really be precise with crayons, but it's, you're still creating data visualizations. And so I see them as more on the other side. And then you do have people from more of the art world, I think creative coding, like Casey Reers and that kind of camp that have been doing this for a very long time, from kind of the art niche. And they're a little bit more abstract and explorative, but they're very heavily technical as well. So there's a lot of interesting players, I think, in the field.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Benjamin's my name. Hi. I was thinking about these Twitter messages, so a question related to what you said. Have you thought about, because you provide the data, you provide the visualization of this data, and then people make up their stories. So stories that you don't know, stories that I don't know, stories that we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So have you thought about like trying to reincorporate this into the interface or in your visualization? I mean, especially for newspapers, there's usually this, here's the article and then I have the comments. People still comment on the article. Like, have you thought about, or is this something that you're interested in from a journalist, database perspective, in trying to have people creating stories on top of these visualization in a way? I was wondering, because you're thinking about these things, so. Like,
yeah, I think,
yeah,
it's definitely helpful to have contributions from like the public. So I think in that tracker, we have a link saying, is there something that's missing? Email us. Obviously, that's not what you're talking about. That's kind of directly reincorporating it back.
Sort of, hey, this one I know.
Yeah.
This is happening because of, and then they leave a mark in the visualization, and then I can go there and say, hey, why is this? Oh, what?
Like almost
Someone
annotations to the visualization.
Like pinboard or whatever, like how do you call it, pinwall?
Yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, logistically, that stuff is kind of tricky because you have to moderate that stuff.
Right,
So then there's already a layer of complexity in adding that. But I do like the general idea of making it collaborative, because again, it really engages people when you see other people kind of responding and going back and forth. So that is quite, crowdfunded data as well is quite interesting.
There's a system that does that for narrative, for stories. I forget what the name of it is, but it allows you to read a story online, and for everyone who's reading it to put comments and narration.
Or text stories?
Yeah, so you highlight a piece of text and you can write a comment next to it, and so it becomes social reading. And
then you can like comment to someone else's comment or things.
You can even do it on SoundCloud, so at points in tracks you can put a comment for that particular time of the track as well.
But the signal to noise ratio is usually
it's
just
terrible.
what they're saying is sick.
Yeah, again with the moderation, like with all internet comments. I mean, I don't need to go on about how that can be, but I think I've heard of that type of tool, but I do remember there being kind of controversy around that, because there's this whole issue around do you opt in when you create content on the internet. If you don't have a comment section, you're essentially kind of putting you're forcing a comment section on something that might not necessarily want it. So there's interesting area.
Any other questions?
Oh, Sarah.
I don't have a question,
Oh,
but I have
Sarah.
a comment. I'd like to see your dancing being projected on the floor, so then the dancer could do it again and see if they could.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do with that. It's like a lot of things. I have a lot of
you
like.
can imagine like learning to do the dance and then having it projected on the floor to help you.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about for that particular data set to create more of a teaching tool, because there's so many nuances to that particular technique. We're kind of seeing if there's a way to be able to teach that particular technique through something. So.
Did you ever try putting it into 3D, like actually mapping it?
No, that was kind of more of like a skill limitation, because I had to learn WebGL and 3JS and whole bunch of other stuff. So I was like, I know what I know, so I'm just gonna see what I can do with that, and then maybe convert it to 3D later on.
So it's obviously looking down, yeah?
Yeah.
Like, did you ever look at what it would look like from, say, the front or the side or anything like that? Do you think that would be, like, if it was to become a teaching tool, do you think having like 3 orthogonal views of the dance from all different directions, would that be helpful or just overload?
That was kind of like the next step.
Yep.
So like I showed you a screenshot of that tool. I wanted to add like X, Y, and Y, Z, and all those types of things. So I could kind of manually do that myself and generate that. But for some reason, I guess spatially, maybe because of the dance or the type of dance, and the ones I picked specifically, they work the best from a bird's eye view. But I imagine there might be dance techniques that look better from front on. But it's also interesting because you don't really see that from the bird's eye view, so you're getting another perspective there.
Isn't there a sense of the aesthetic, though, as a designer coming to this? That's what you're bringing to it, isn't it? That aesthetic. I know it's going to, from the top, work well.
Yeah, and it's not something you'd ever see, like, obviously not the dots or it being drawn out as the lines, but you don't see that perspective. But that was the most visually interesting. I think the front-on view, there's a lot of kind of overlaps, whereas the top view, I guess, because she started at the back and moved forward in space, it was a lot more interesting.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Did the dancer see this while she was dancing, or is this?
No, just after, because
Just
they
after,
captured it while she was in the suit in the lab. And then,
Do it real time?
yeah, I mean that was one of the topics that they were playing around with, more doing
Okay.
real time rendering and doing that kind of stuff. But yeah, you'd have to figure out how to stream the data and do all that. So it was a four day lab. So I was like, what can I do in these 4 days? So yeah.
Do you have another question? That stream from science to art that you showed right at the beginning, how are you finding social sciences fitting in there?
I think that's where the big topic of ethics kind of comes in a lot more. I think that needs to be talked about a lot more in this space. And so there was actually an interesting incident a few months ago where a designer released a bunch of data visualizations around the Hiroshima bombings, and then this whole topic escalated on Twitter about whether or not that was a sensitive representation of that data, and if it considered the people and the sensitivity behind the events well enough. And so I think that's where the importance of having the social science where you have like the responsibility to showing the numbers accurately, and the creative graphic designers to kind of learn from each other, because if you're just learning graphic design, you're going to concentrate on the aesthetics, you're going to concentrate on form, but you might not think about the social context. And so that's the immediate thing that jumped to mind.
Yeah, that's interesting. That other question I asked about emotions and empathy coming from it, clearly that had an emotional reaction from the audience at Hiroshima.
Yeah, I mean, it was beautiful. It was just brought up that debate about whether or not if something is beautiful but not really sensitive, is that appropriate? And if is there a sense of responsibility as a designer to create that kind of work? So that was an interesting debate.
So maybe just following on from that a little bit. So when you work on a project at The Guardian, for example, is it someone comes to you and says, here's what we want to look at, and then it's up to you to work out how to visualize it, or do you pick the topic? How does the actual process work of coming up with the way that you visualize information? So, you know, in the election, I guess, you know, one of the things is you've got to appear at least to be balanced and fair, and to treat each person with the, you know, numerically you've got to kind of do that as well. Is that limiting, or is it easier because it's more clearly defined how the constraints that you have to work with?
So with the platform of The Guardian, you're saying, or is it more?
I'm sorry, it was a very vague question. It was really about the process, about how you. So like, I guess when you were doing the visualizations that you did, they to me seem to have a really strong sense of narrative, and they're personally driven about you found something that you really wanted to make visual to tell a story.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering, I guess if you're working for a newspaper which is getting all this information in, you can't quite be so selective about what you choose to visualise and what you don't. So do you approach it differently?
There's obviously stylistic constraints, like The Guardian has a certain voice that you have to keep in mind when you're creating this stuff. But I don't think that the constraints are as limiting as it would seem, because you're essentially like with those projects that I did around gender, I wasn't necessarily. I mean, I had had an opinion about those. That's why I did those projects. But I wasn't trying to push a certain narrative on them. I just wanted to draw that out through the data.
But it does tell a story, though.
Yeah, it does.
It does it really well.
Yeah, and I feel like data journalism should kind of work in the same way. I don't really see a difference. I think if that data set came to my desk at The Guardian now, I don't know if I would have done things differently or have restrained. I definitely don't want to cross that line where I'm kind of like putting my own biases or whatever into that work. I kind of draw them out rather than, so.
Okay, any more questions? So please join me in thanking Marie again for